Proud supporters of Africa this week. Engine, with us, you are number one.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Africa This Week, your wrap of what happened across the continent. I'm Mashudu Masuta. Prospecting activity on the African continent has increased sharply in recent years. It is estimated that around 20% of the world's oil and gas production will come from Africa by 2020. Bradley Surf, Vice President of the Commercial Division of Oil Group, SACOIL, spoke to us about the role South Africa can play in Africa's energy sector.
Africa's a big place, and there's a lot of new geological basins that have been explored in the recent years. In the last 20 years, I'd say there's been a lot of focus on West Africa, particularly the Niger Delta, as well as the Gulf of Guinea.
Yeah.
If you also look at the east coast of Africa, there's been big discoveries, particularly in Mozambique, related to gas, as well as the very prolific Albertine Graben in Uganda and Tullow's success there. So if you look at, in terms of opportunities for new players, new entrants to the market, there's certainly still opportunities in the mature areas in West Africa, and there's definitely opportunities in the Albertine Graben as well as East and West Africa.
With all these opportunities and the fact that obviously we've seen Africa record something like 127 billion barrels in reserves, the issue is why all of these are untapped. Why are the investments slow in coming through?
Well, it's a combination of a few things. Firstly, it's fiscal stability. Investors, specifically oil and gas majors and the small independents, they like certainty. And if there's any uncertainty, they tend to stay away. Also, Africa has been plagued by political instability as well. And also, Africa's a big continent. There are a number of geological basins and a lot of places to explore. So what's happened in the last couple of years is that political stability, it's been more stable. The fiscal environment has changed as well. And there's also been a reduction in political instability. So what's happened now is that those markets are now opening up. And that's why in the last 5 to 10 years, you've had the big discoveries in the Albertine Graben. You've had East Africa opening up, as well as West Africa, like Ghana, where there's been the big Jubilee discovery. So there's continued changes in the fiscal environment, and countries are now mindful that they need to attract investors to these prolific oil provinces.
Within that context, though, there are also regulatory issues, and you talk about certainty. Nigeria's much delayed petroleum industry bill has got many investors quite worried as to what deregulation means in that particular economy. For instance, in Kenya, they've issued over 18 prospecting licenses, and to date, there's no success. So even when governments are mindful of the opportunities, they're still very, very slow in terms of just opening up that space. What does that create in terms of challenges for operations?
Well, in terms of the operations, one needs to be mindful that there's a value chain in terms of oil and gas, specifically the upstream value chain. So firstly, in new basins, you need to go through that value chain. So the first part is the exploration, then you go into appraisal, then you go into development, and then you go into production. So typically in Kenya, it's a new graben, it's a new play, and investors have come in. They've relied on the fiscal certainty. They're now looking at exploration. Exploration timeframes are generally 1 to 5 years. Once they've made they've identified prospects and they're comfortable with the prospectivity, they now go and they sink some serious money into that. Then what happens once they find these oil and gas deposits, they go into development and production. Obviously, those oil and gas deposits need to be commercial. So they also need to be, besides the general geological aspect of it, there needs to be the commercial aspect that needs to make sense for oil and gas companies.
Let's talk about that, because the FTSE Oil and Gas Index shows that there's renewed interest now in junior miners as opposed to the traditional players. We've seen investment growth of 20%. But when market conditions change, it's the junior miners that are hammered, effectively because a lot of them are at the exploration phase. We don't see productive assets. Some would say that's a similar situation for SACOIL. How do you make an investment case in a market like this?
Well, certainly for SACOIL, being a junior as well, we definitely a bit different to most of the other entities and companies listed on the FTSE. We have distinctive South African and African DNA. We're listed on the JSE, and we're also listed on AIM in London. We have an African identity, and we're trying to use this now to build a balanced portfolio for SACWEL. So what you'll see from our operations, we have operations in the DRC, in the very prolific Albertine Graben, on the DRC side of the Graben. And there, if you look at what's happened on the Ugandan side, there's 1 billion barrels of resource discovered. So SACWEL, what we've done is we've gone into acreage, we've gone into areas that have the potential for large and prolific discoveries.
A 3-day conference to thrash out, amongst other things, a roadmap to a new constitution and elections within a year in Somalia kicked off in Mogadishu this week. It is the first major political conference since the start of a 2007 insurgency. Dr. Petrus de Kok, senior researcher in the Governance of Africa's Resources program at the South African Institute of International Affairs, assessed the country's chances for stability.
We should see the conference in the background of quite major events in Somalia in recent months. The first of which is the withdrawal of Al-Shabaab during the end of July, beginning of August from Mogadishu. That was quite surprising, but I think that is part of the reason for that is a very effective counter-insurgency battle that's been fought by African Union forces on the ground, where literally block by block they had to liberate the city of Al-Shabaab control. Now, the announcement of the withdrawal of Al-Shabaab, there's many interpretations of it, but I think the important thing is that the famine in the country and the drought has actually made it much more difficult for Al-Shabaab to get support from locals in other areas that they control. So strategically they had to withdraw, but this gives an opportunity now for the transitional government structures to engage in a more extensive political process. And this is something that's had to happen a long time ago already, especially symbolically that it is happening in Mogadishu. Mogadishu has been under control of different factions, warlords and Al-Shabaab and other organizations for 20 years. So this is a very small step, but it's an important moment, I think.
I mean, since civil war broke out effectively in 1991, we've seen so many attempts at diplomatically brokering some sort of a government of national union, a transition, and every so often it fails. I mean, people call Somalia the ultimate failed state. Why should we believe in the process that's currently underway?
I think one of the reasons for that is that within a context of historical chaos, you know, there was a period in time where Mogadishu itself was cut up in something like 15 or 16 zones, each controlled by a different warlord. So the fact that you have one authority now at this point in time kind of controlling the whole of the capital city. Al-Shabaab still controls vast areas of the internal country of Somalia. So the military fight against Al-Shabaab is going to continue, but it's kind of comparable to what's happening in Libya, where now you have a moment where one authority can negotiate with other parties inside the country to reconstruct exactly the thing that you are talking about, to reconstruct a functional government and to establish the kind of services that will get the allegiance of people, to get institutions that can actually effectively service people, even if it is just at the most basic level, like access to food, water, education, health, those kind of things. That's the rollout that has to happen now. And I think in that we must credit the African Union for launching what seems to be an effective counterinsurgency firstly, and opening the strategic security space, you know, in which this can happen. So a lot of support is going to be needed, and I think the African Union will have to deepen its operations at a humanitarian and as well as at a developmental level to bring kind of the support structures in place for this thing to and I mean, Petrus,
the economic reconstruction is made even more urgent by the drought situation and the famine that's unfolded. I mean, statistics show that 4 million people are at risk at the moment. The death toll is rising and affecting all political sides, all clans, all people. How are they going to find a solution to this particularly depressing humanitarian situation? Because that's even more urgent than a political settlement.
Yes, I think the crisis at the humanitarian level is something that's been rolling for at least 2 decades now. But this is a very bad moment, because of an extended drought period. And we must also remember that in the Horn of Africa region, there's a significant amount of percentage of the population that live as pastoralists or semi-nomadic lives who depend on livestock. So if you have a drought, your basic source of economic survival is wiped out, and this has led, together with the war, as you say, to an incredibly deep humanitarian crisis. But I think the humanitarian crisis it'll be easier to intervene if you have, for example, removed the Al-Shabaab threat from parts of the internal Somalia, because they still refuse access to certain areas under their control for aid agencies to access. So that means that the humanitarian situation, the solution to that, is also highly influenced by what happens at a political level. Because if the guys in Mogadishu can step beyond their own kind of egos and distrust of each other, by reaching an agreement of how to move forward politically in the country, they can also then maybe strengthen the hand of forces under the control of the government to fight back the Al-Shabaab insurgency.
And
Al-Shabaab is clearly losing some social ground in terms of social support, also because of the famine and the way they have handled the situation.
And obviously, if Al-Shabaab, for instance, is refusing for some aid agencies to operate in the areas that they control, it speaks to the whole question broadly of how donor funds flow, and in the event of peace, how investment funds would flow into a country like Somalia. What sort of strategic thinking is needed at a time like this?
I think the strategic thinking that's needed, is really identifying a crop of leaders, that represent the different kinds of voices inside Somalia. Because the strange thing in Somalia is that culturally it's quite homogenous. The differences lie at the level of clans and sub-clans and those kind of things, and different kinds of political allegiances. So I think to handle aid monies, to handle investments properly, you need to establish a kind of level of institutional trust where different actors in the country feel satisfied that their political needs are taken care of, and then to force them into open, transparent ways of dealing with these things. Because you're moving now from a war economy into another type of more regulated economy that has to engage in a responsible way with international institutions. And that is a challenge the world over. And I think the Somalis themselves will have to find a way of just stepping up to the plate in doing this. Because the Somalis themselves say, we destroyed our own city. For 20 years, it's Somalis fighting each other. It's nobody else invading them from the outside. So the point is, they will have to make the psychological, political switch to engage in a new process of revival.
After the break, more stories making headlines this week.